Hello and welcome to Himal Interviews. I'm Shubhanga Pandey, Chief Editor of Himal Southasian. In this episode of Himal Interviews, I'll be speaking to an expert on Myanmar's ethnic conflict and its borderlands on how the military coup of February the 1st will impact the country's unresolved ethnic conflicts and the ongoing negotiations between the state and the various rebel groups. Along with that, we will also look at the record of the international community's engagement with Myanmar since the resumption of democracy in 2012 and see what it might look like in the days ahead. David Brenner is a Himal contributor and the author of Rebel Politics, a political sociology of armed struggle in Myanmar's borderlands. David is also a lecturer at the School of Global Studies in the University of Sussex. Hello, David. Welcome to Himal Podcasts.
Hi, Shubhanga. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
So I wanted to begin by asking about how Myanmar's various ethnic rebel groups have reacted to the military takeover in the country. And what happens to the ongoing negotiations, now that the civilian government is no longer in power, because, despite all the writing and analysis on the issue, there seems to be a lot of focus on what one might call the civil-military relations, but the ethnic conflict aspect of it seems to have been left out. Could you describe that for us?
Thanks, Shubhanga. That's a really important question. And you're absolutely right. We hear a lot about civil-military relations, Aung San Suu Kyi, the NLD, etc., so the National League for Democracy in Myanmar. But it's really important to not forget that we're talking about a country that has just seen a genocide on one of its ethnic minority communities, the Rohingya people. And it's also a country that has seen the longest ongoing civil war in the world. It's been ongoing for about 75 years, since the country's independence. We're speaking about a multitude of different ethnic armed organizations in the border areas of the country. And you're absolutely right that this will have strong ramifications for them and for the peace process. At the moment, I think there's a few things to be, that we should point out briefly. The first thing is that some movements have already made statements that they're very disconcerted, obviously, about what is happening. So, for instance, the RCSS, Shan movement, or the KNU, the oldest rebel movement in the country, the Kareni movement on the Thai border, they've released statements, the KIO as well. They're fearing military offensives, to come. At the same time, we should not forget that those movements are also quite fragmented. And that they have, military leaders, or some of them at least, that have been dealing with the military, the Burmese state military, for a while, right? And that there is some reshuffling and reorganization going on. Just very briefly, one story that I think, is telling about this is that one of the previous leaders from the KNU, from the Kareni rebellion, has actually now switched sides and has gone to work for the military junta. And he's always been one of the leaders that has actually also during the time before Aung San Suu Kyi, the time of U Thein Sein, so who held the kind of semi-military government's position of the president between 2011 and 2015, they've been dealing quite closely with each other. So what I'm saying here that, we have to watch this fragmentation going on these different sides. What that might mean for the ongoing negotiations, is of course, a very, very important question as well. What we've seen, since 2011, is that first the U Thein Sein government, previous to Aung San Suu Kyi's administration, has reached out to a variety of these ethnic armed organizations in the country, and has tried to build something that they termed the nationwide ceasefire agreement, which was never nationwide, which excluded quite a lot of organizations. And indeed, during that time, the civil war in places like the north of the country has escalated to unseen degrees, actually. And under Aung San Suu Kyi, we've seen a much larger project, the so-called Panglong Peace Agreement project. So that refers back to the Panglong Agreement that Aung San Suu Kyi's father, General Aung San, signed with ethnic minority leaders after the independence of the country, which basically, the importance here is to negotiate federalism and power sharing between the Burma ethnic majority and ethnic minorities in the country. So that peace process has been more inclusive, maybe, and indeed it's seen something like 1,800 delegates coming together in Naypyidaw on like different, occasions and so on. But also it hasn't really led anywhere. In fact, it's been stalling for a long time, and there's a variety of reasons for that. One thing that, might contribute to some ongoing or the kind of renewal of negotiations is that ethnic armed organization leaders can now directly negotiate with the military again. During the time of Aung San Suu Kyi, of course, they had to double negotiate with the government and with the military. The government could not control the military, right, in many ways, and still there needed to be this kind of double negotiation going on, etc. And when you actually look at some of those dynamics at the actual negotiations between ethnic armed groups and the military, there's also another thing that, we need to keep in mind, many resentments as there are on both sides, right? Many of the actual leaders of these ethnic armed organizations and the military respect each other in some ways. Maybe in some ways more than there was respect, between civilian politicians and ethnic armed group leaders. And that does not necessarily need to entail negotiation outcomes that are good for local communities, to be held in mind, but it actually makes negotiations more effective. Now, of course, one needs to see how to bring in critical voices from civil society and local communities in what otherwise can become rather exclusive negotiations that privilege investment over rights of people, for instance.
That brings me to my next question, and which is, really about, over the past decade, we've seen, process of democratization, and there's been a lot of activity on that front and international interest. But how have the ethnic minority groups themselves seen this process of political reform, let's say, since 2011-12?
That is a very good question again, right? But just to review, we are speaking about roughly a decade now of a transition, 2011 to now. And so in the first kind of part of the decade, there was this kind of semi-civilian, semi-military administration. And then in 2015, we saw Aung San Suu Kyi coming to power in a landslide victory in those elections, actually taking power in 2016 then. For the ethnic minority communities, this process of political reforms has, in some places, brought, a lot of positive changes as well, of course. Across the country, we've seen, of course, very tangible benefits for people's livelihoods, healthcare, education opportunities, etc. The public sphere, of course, has opened up to an unseen degree, or at least, a degree that hasn't been seen for a long time. And so there's been, many, civil society organizations, outspoken and so on, to really like remarkable degrees across the country. And at the same time, we need to be remembering that many of the ethnic minority communities have experienced an escalation of conflict and violence in this same period. And here again, we need to differentiate a little bit between ethnic minority communities living, say, in urban spaces that are, for instance, controlled by the government, and that still received more oppression than non-ethnic communities in urban spaces controlled by the government. But at the same time, right, we also need to be really wary about, many of the communities who are living, in spaces that are in mixed controlled areas, that are in the actual conflict zones, So, for instance, we've seen like about 140,000 internally displaced people in the north of the country, in Kachin and in Shan states during the time, during the escalation of war there, many of whom, have been cut off from humanitarian access, because they're in places that are not controlled by the government, and therefore the government has been like, restricting access of international agencies to deliver humanitarian aid. There's been, an escalation of conflict and, between the military and ethnic armed organization, but also a deepening of ethnic conflict on a communal level. Most pronouncedly, of course, in Rakhine State, but also elsewhere in the country. And this is, of course, something, especially also Muslim communities who felt the brunt everywhere in the country, because they go beyond the Rohingya community. And then I think it's important to note what happened when Aung San Suu Kyi came into power in 2015. Because many ethnic minorities placed a lot of hope in her ability to unite the country. right? I mean, indeed, her landslide victory in 2015 was not least secured by the support from ethnic minority voters. But since she has taken power, the armed conflict has continued unabated, even intensified, certainly in the west of the country. And many erstwhile supporters of Aung San Suu Kyi from the ethnic minority communities have felt let down, right? And rightfully so, of course. And not only because, I mean, they were aware that she cannot necessarily control the military's activities, right? But then they hoped for more, for instance, in terms of humanitarian access. Since she came in power, humanitarian access closed completely to some places in the north. But also, of course, they were taken aback the most by her silence on the atrocities of the military and by often actually condoning the military's deeds, right? Most prominently when she traveled, of course, to The Hague to defend the military in front of the International Criminal, in front of the International Court of Justice. But also, on a domestic level, when she, for instance, was praising the quote valiant efforts of the Tatmadaw security forces, end quote, for in their combat against ethnic armed organizations in the north, when she was endorsing the military on so many ways.
You've also recently written about what you call the misconstrued international strategy towards Myanmar, their general shift in priority away from supporting grassroots movements and towards state bureaucracies. Could you unpack what you mean by that, and how ethnic groups in the country see this change?
I think I was, first of all, I was privileged to, when I came to Myanmar for my research, in the first place. It was about the time of transition, 2011, 2012. I was privileged because I came to Myanmar through the border areas, through the places and activist groups and resistance movements of ethnic minorities in the border areas, who were always very cautious about the transition act, and who were always saying two things. One is that we're not sure whether we're seeing democratization here, or maybe a more general reorganization of power. The other thing is also democratization is not, necessarily the first thing that needs to, occur in a place where that might simply just mean, more oppression, by a majoritarian system, right? But minority rights, power sharing, resource sharing, all of those things, need to be addressed. Anyway, the thing here is that large parts of the Western donor community that came to Myanmar at the same time saw what is happening in Myanmar primarily, though, through that lens of democratization. And I'm saying that this was not only analytically wrong in terms of what has been happening, but also it's been politically problematic, actually. Because by operating on that assumption, there was a large-scale shift. What happened in terms of what Western donors did in terms of supporting different kinds of organizations. There used to be a rather vibrant scene on the border Thailand and Burma during very dark days of military rule in Myanmar, where basically you had Western donors and so on supporting much more activist grassroots networks that were linked to a very diverse kind of things, from NLD to 1988 student generations, to different ethnic resistance movements and activists, etc. So there was actually a cosmopolitan place there, inter-ethnic alliances and so on. And it had its own problems. I'm not gonna do away with that. I'm just for the sake of brevity, of course, point that out. And that kind of donor money has wholesale shifted to inside Myanmar, in this idea that Myanmar is not democratic. What happened through that, of course, is twofold. On the one hand, that was great for actually, supporting a very vibrant civil society inside. So I'm not saying all of that was wrong, right? I think there's been a lot of good things that. On the other hand, though, the donors basically crash landed at this time without much knowledge of, the place, and trying to kind of, use, approaches that they've had in other places of the world, and this is how development often works, isn't it? Then to come in and do very similar things, Here, importantly then though, a lot of funds were channeled directly into these militarized state bureaucracies. Because we need to be clear. The 2008 constitution is very clear that we're not seeing democratization as such, that the military who produced that constitution is holding on to significant parts of power, including ministries and bureaucracies in the country, right? And here I want to point out, in particular, the Ministry of Border Affairs, which is, also known as Natala in Burma, and which is basically a ministry that is, tasked to develop the ethnic minorities, in quote, in the border areas, and to kind of, bring some form of, like, here in quotes again, of course, civilization. And it's always been this kind of, sort of social approach to counterinsurgency in the country, as you can see. And where development has always been used as counterinsurgency, for a long time, throughout the 1990s. Mm-hmm. And that was actually, the first recipient of an $80 million World Bank grant, which, I think on their website they said something about like grassroots-led, development and so on. But it was flowing directly into the Ministry of Border Affairs, which is basically the military in civilian clothes. Similarly, we've seen other such instances happen. We've basically seen, how, Western donors have not understood whom they're dealing with in the first place, and have therefore then channeled money into places that have been then co-opted by the military that remain very strong, of course, for the building of a more authoritarian and ethnocratic place, and for counterinsurgency purposes.
And how have the ethnic minority groups and their representatives reacted to this development?
So just very briefly, another one of those, really telling projects has been funded by the multi-donor Myanmar Peace Support Initiative, which is the forerunner of what is now the Joint Peace Fund, and which basically was created to derive some quick peace dividends and buy into the peace process and so on amongst the conflict-affected communities. And one of their many projects, which was in Kaya or Kareni state, in kind of the east of the country, was basically to resettle refugees in a place called Shadong. And here in Shadong township, they were basically building villages to resettle these people that were built, of course, by the Ministry, for Border Affairs in the end, again, were used for counterinsurgency purposes. They were highly militarized, where people were surveilled, where the military grabbed land, etc. The Finnish Ministry for Foreign Affairs, which was funding the project, small project, pilot project, but nevertheless telling, was kind of going, to visit the place and, basically was spelling out how everything was all right in a report, etc. And then there was a umbrella group of Kareni, so local ethnic minority civil society organization called the Kareni Civil Society Network. And they voiced very strong concern about that project in a report, where they were kind of, spelling out all the militarization and land grabbing and so on that was going on there, that there's military intelligence everywhere in those villages and so on. And well, at the time, the Finnish Ministry for Foreign Affairs actually then responded, by saying, "Oh, but when we were there, the military, didn't have arms and they were really nice. Plus, they might be speaking about different villages altogether because they're using different names. Whereas, it was clear that the Kaya Civil Society Network was using the local names and the local Kaya language, and they were referring to those villages in Burmese, from their kind of ministerial level. So you just see, like, obviously, not just differences in perception, right, but also like how those, very important voices from the civil society side, from the local community-based side, have been sidelined, have not been listened to, have been ignored. And so obviously they've been frustrated, right?
Well, moving on to the kind of international dimension of the issue, there's been a lot of interest among, international relations pundits and foreign affairs analysts on what the geopolitical fallout of this will be. Does the analysis of the situation change when we take into account what's happening in the borderlands? All the economic and political changes that have happened, over the last 10, 15 years. Is the assessment different that way?
And in very brief, yes, of course it does, right? Like, we can't understand the transition of Myanmar in the first place without understanding those kind of dynamics between the border areas and the center. And those really border worlds of the country. We can't understand the ethnic conflict. We can't understand the kind of regional politics around it at all without that. Maybe just to go back and maybe just briefly highlight, one thing in terms of that. International relations, of course, thinks a lot about kind of, different states, as if they were containers, isn't it? I mean, international relations, I know sorts of that is, of course, the main approach to things, whereas actually, those border areas, I would call them border worlds on the basis of what Mendy Sadan was writing about them. They've been connected in so many ways, right? And not just now, but throughout history. Like for instance, the northeast of India has always been very intimately connected to the politics of the border areas of Myanmar, right? In terms of those different projects, the conflicts coming up there, etc. So this is of course important, and these things have an effect back to the international politics of things. And China understands this quite clearly, and this is maybe just like, because I know some of your audience might be very interested in this idea of China and the US, etc. But this is of course something to keep in mind. China has been on the one hand, of course, having this kind of policy of non-intervention, non-interference, and so on, and on the other hand, of course, in its actual neighborhood, that has gone completely out of the window, right? And it had a very, long-standing, complex relation with different armed groups in that area, right? Now, for instance, one thing is, all the kind of, COVID measures and control, right? Some of the rebel groups on the Burmese side are, cooperating, quite closely with the China Center for Disease Control on the Chinese side, because of course, that's in China's own interest, right? And at the same time, China has been playing a stick and carrots game with the Myanmar military and government, for a long time, in terms of sometimes supporting some of those armies more, sometimes, letting loose of that support a little bit more, depending on how, the Myanmar foreign policy has been kind of arranged towards, competing powers. And that is something we'll see going on. And maybe just the very last word on this, of course, is that what is striking, of course, is that on the one hand, China will continue being a supporter of Myanmar, including in the United Nations Security Council. And there's no doubt about that. It has own very, strong interests. So to come back to, the borderland dynamics and so on, in terms of, pipelines and what have you, right? In terms of the actual geo-economics of the place, and geopolitics of the place. But on the other hand, the Chinese, Beijing won't be very happy, or is not certainly very happy about the coup in Myanmar. They've just established a rather good working relationship with Aung San Suu Kyi's administration that in many ways has had seen a better working relationship than with the generals before, because Myanmar's generals have always been very wary about China. And not least because they, have to deal with China's support to, a variety of rebel movements, right? Direct and indirect support, right? And also, generally because they have been very wary of becoming too dependent on China, for instance, right? So there's actually a little bit more of a rupture there at the moment that, one might read somewhere.
I think as we go ahead, we're likely to hear a lot of debates on possible sanctions on the state, including economic sanctions. How do you think that would affect chances for democracy, but also, how would it affect the peace process? Given what we know about, the history of sanctions and its impact on the state. And I think just to add something to that, what can those outside Myanmar and who are interested in, democracy in Myanmar and progressive transformation of Myanmar, what can they do?
Yeah. So again, very good questions, and I'll, only be able to scratch the surface, of course. But first of all, on the question about sanctions, I don't believe sanctions have necessarily worked throughout the 1990s. I think Lee Jones has done quite some insightful research on that. So I would also refer you, to Lee Jones at Queen Mary's University of London on, tracing very detailedly how they have not worked. Just one thing maybe, to illustrate some of that. It's not just that they haven't worked so much, but that they might have actually deepened some of the conflict and the military power in terms of their economic power as well. The political economy of Myanmar is a very particular one that is very, deeply intertwined with the country's conflict. And that is based on resource economies. It's based on narcotics. It's based on, a lot of, now large scale investment and so on. And one thing that we've seen throughout the sanctions period is that the Myanmar government has basically channeled money from these conflict economies, from these illegal, illicit, informal economies, into the formal fold. And, not only been able to finance itself, but also finance infrastructure, construction, etc. throughout that, right? And on top of that, of course, you have enough regional powers and neighbors and so on that are not necessarily, going along with those sanctions, right? What I was saying is not only that, blanket sanctions anyways won't work, right? In terms of efficacy, but they might even make some of those things worse in terms of strengthening some of the political economy power hold of the military over the country, right? And there's, some really important, maybe paradoxical effects that need to be watched there. I think, though, everyone who is interested in supporting Myanmar, etc., well, two things. If we're private people, etc., one thing we could really do is, especially if we're interested in following the events there, is to support some of the very critical and important media outlets that we've seen in Myanmar. So Frontier Myanmar, for instance, Irrawaddy, Burma News International, they've been around for a while and they have all been, instrumental in driving progressive change in Myanmar. And they're all struggling at the moment, of course. They're struggling in terms of, where to go, offices, people are being arrested, journalists are being arrested, activists are being arrested. It's not just the NLD cadres and Aung San Suu Kyi who's been arrested, but a lot of these people as well. So they're in a, very pragmatic and straightforward sense. Everyone can donate to, those outlets. Again, for instance, Frontier Myanmar, Irrawaddy, Burma News International, right? The other thing, and a more general, I think, for, international, engagement with Myanmar and so on, want to come back to, my earlier point about, what happened with 2011 and the transition, and then all of a sudden, a lot of, long-standing, activist, networks and so on have been left alone by, donors, where then the money was shifting to, more like, other places, etc. I think we really have to see, how we can not just, re-engage with many of the critical voices that have been left alone, but also, how we can bring about a fruitful and progressive convergence of the different oppositions that are there in Myanmar, right? Because the opposition isn't only Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD. I mean, as a matter of fact, and it's not surprising maybe to hear after what's been happening in Rakhine and so on, that is not the most radical progressive force in the country at all, right? But, the 88 generation is still there, right? Like different, so many different civil society organizations, community-based organizations, right? And I think really what needs to happen there is a cosmopolitan, like kind of, inter-ethnic alliance, that we've used to see really much more in the 1990s, and how that can be supported here. Right. I think that is maybe, from a more, international engagement point of perspective. The really important thing. And where, I very much believe that we'll have to listen to inconvenient truths, first of all, about, how engagement, the engagement that we've seen from, the West in particular over the last 10 years, what the pitfalls were, and how, we can do better and we can learn from that. Right.
Well, that brings us to the end of the episode, and thank you, David, so much for joining us.
Thanks also to you, Shubhanga. Always happy to contribute to Himal.
For more Himal podcasts, go to himalmag.com/podcasts.